Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of the miracles of Jesus, continue to get to look at his miracles of provision, healing, and exorcism, and continue to see his growing relationship with the disciples emphasized in this particular section of miracles. We got the chance yesterday to look at one of the healings in the Gospel of Mark. It's actually unique to the Gospel of Mark, but it's part of a general focus of Jesus' ministry on the Gentiles at this time period that's going to translate into a more fuller understanding by the disciples, these 12 apostles, of who Jesus is, of what his mission is. And so there was a healing of a deaf and dumb man, and now we're going to get into the next great miracle of Jesus, which is the feeding of the 4,000. Now, there's a lot of similarities in the accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, which is recorded in all four Gospels, and the feeding of the 4,000, which is recorded just in Matthew and Mark. And so there have been some critical scholars who have tried to make the argument that these are the same miracle, repeated twice for some reason in Matthew and Mark. I really don't think there's a lot of strong argumentation for that. There are some different details, and it's pretty clear that both miracles are being used in different capacities. And so just because there's similarities in it certainly does not mean that there are only one time where Jesus fed people. In fact, given the number of times that it's emphasized to us that these are just a small sampling of the miracles of Jesus, my suspicion is that this is probably not even the only two times that Jesus does this. Just like the gospel miracles we have recorded are not the only example of Jesus healing or performing exorcisms or doing all these other things. So we can take confidence that this is a separate event. And I think it's partly being recorded in Mark and then later Matthew for the purpose of emphasis. And in particular, what we're going to see is it's really emphasizing the disciples still having a problem with understanding who Jesus is. These two accounts are very, very similar, so we're going to really spend most of our time today in Mark because that's going to kind of continue the train of thought that's going to lead into our discussion on Monday of my favorite miracle, which is the healing of the blind man. So let's go ahead and dive into Mark chapter 8. This is paralleled in Matthew 15. Mark chapter 8 and verse 1. It says, in those days, when there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them will have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them, and they also served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered those to be served as well. They ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. So again, we see a lot of similarities in what's going on here. Remember, one of the big differences, though, is that this is a predominantly Gentile audience. Remember, Jesus is still in kind of the Gentile region. He's still around the Sea of Galilee, but over on the Gentile side of this. Mark makes that pretty explicit given the stories that are bracketing this. Matthew, not quite as explicit, but both Gospels seem to be in agreement that this is predominantly a Gentile audience. And so remember, when we talked about the feeding of the 5,000, we talked about how it had a lot of Eucharistic overtones, a lot of similarities to the communion supper that we're going to see at the very end of the gospel, where Jesus shares this meal with his disciples, inviting them in to fellowship with him. So with these two miracles combined, we're getting the picture that this messianic feast, this foreshadowing, is taking place not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles as well. And it's very similar to what we saw in the healing of the centurion's servant in Capernaum, where Jesus makes the very extravagant point that there are going to be many people from the nations of the world that are going to break bread with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so there's been this kind of idea of the Gentiles and the Jews both coming together in this messianic feast. And so there is certainly a parallel in that. It's also interesting that Mark records, and Matthew does as well, that these 4,000 people, they're actually not the ones that are worried about this. Jesus, out of his compassion, makes the note that, hey, we need to feed these people because they've been here for 3 days. Matthew notes that Jesus has been doing a round of healing. He's been, again, doing his normal thing of healing people and casting out demons. He's apparently been doing this and teaching for 3 days, and the people have stayed there with him. And I think that's intended perhaps to be a little bit of a reflection, because John's account of the feeding of the 5,000 makes it clear that the original audience, they really were just following him for free food. These people have been following him because they want to hear the teachings. They want to have the healings. They want to be with Jesus, and have been for 3 days without complaining about food. And so now it's Jesus' compassion that motivates this. And so it's possible there's another kind of this hint of the Gentile righteousness compared to the failure of the Jewish nation to understand who Jesus was. And so certainly there's kind of some contrasting elements you can play in there. But one of the things that's very clear is that why are the disciples reacting the exact same way they did at the miracle of the 5,000? They've seen Jesus feed a larger crowd with less bread. And when Jesus says, hey, let's feed these people, their first reaction is still, well, we don't have enough bread for these people, and this is kind of a scarce place for scavenging anything. What are we supposed to do? And I think that really is intentional to show us that the disciples, despite being eyewitnesses to these incredible things, are still not fully putting the pieces together. They're still not fully understanding who Jesus is and what he's capable of, and they still don't have the trust in him that they're required. And so we see again that Mark's point that their heart of heart, it's still true. Again, they're not to push too far on this. I mean, again, they are with Jesus. They're staying with Jesus. They've stayed with Jesus even in spite of some controversy and some frustrating teachings that have driven other people away. So they should certainly be commended for their faith, but they're still growing, and they still have a lot of room to grow. And here you almost see the repeat of the miracle, because the apostles still haven't learned the lesson. And yet, in spite of that, Jesus' compassion still shines through. They feed these people again. There's numerous leftovers, which, for our culture, that's a very common thing to have leftover food, but that's really not a big concept in this time period. You typically had just enough food to scrape by if you were lucky. Sometimes you didn't even have enough food to feel full. And so the idea of this bounty of leftovers and 7 baskets filled, it just shows again that the Lord provides more than enough, more than what is needed. Sometimes you'll see commentaries try to make kind of symbolic language here with the idea of 7 loaves and the 5 loaves and 12 baskets and 7 baskets left over. I think that's probably, if there is symbolism, it's probably pretty loose in that capacity. I'm not sure I would press that point too far. Probably the bigger point is to emphasize the amount of leftovers. But it certainly could be possible that there's some elements of perfection. 7 is the number that often designates a complete whole. It's very much a holy number, often used the 7 spirits of God, the 7 candlesticks, different things like that. So there's a possibility of some symbolism there, but I wouldn't push that too far. Now, the conclusion to this miracle is really where we're going to pick up kind of the next big evolution here. Because after Jesus does this miracle, he's going to go to this new region, Dalmanutha, likely the similar area. We don't have a whole lot of knowledge on exactly where Dalmanutha is. It's pretty unattested comparatively. More than likely kind of in the same region, perhaps a small fishing village. But it happens there that the Pharisees came out. In verse 11, it says, they began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And so again, we see the emotional language of Mark here. Matthew kind of expands this a little bit further in chapter 16, in verse 2, after Jesus asks him the same thing. They want to see a sign from heaven. Matthew includes the Sadducees as well, which indicates this is a little bit broader crowd. Typically, you don't see the Sadducees play a huge role in Mark until a little bit later in their text. But he replied to them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given it except the sign of Jonah. And so we see Matthew and Mark kind of emphasizing 2 different things. Mark really emphasized, despite being such a short gospel, Mark really emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. It really emphasizes the emotions of Jesus. He sighs deeply, and he's so frustrated. And can you imagine being God, being the creator of the whole universe, having demonstrated to all of Judea your power over life and death, your power over physical matter, your power over the storms and nature and all these things? And these teachers of the law, the people that you've entrusted as God to lead the people, they come there like, well, if you're really who you claim to be, we'd like some proof. And he's so frustrated. He deeply sighs and says, you don't want to follow me. You're not seeking a sign because you want to know who I am. You're not seeking a sign because you want so desperately to follow me and to know what God's will is. You're testing me. Jesus knows their hearts. He knows that they just want to prove him wrong. And he even makes that comment that Matthew kind of expounds upon this. He says, you guys are so good at discerning signs that you can read the weather and you can understand based off of what the morning sky or the evening sky is going to be. You can predict weather. But you can't look at what's right in front of you. You can't see the obvious. I'm not going to give you a sign just for your understanding, but he prophesies there will be a sign that will be for all to understand. It's the sign of Jonah. And it reminds us again, even here in kind of the middle of the story, that ultimately this story is all about that sign of Jonah, of Jesus going into the grave for 3 days, going into the very heart of death and emerging again, alive and victorious over death. And ultimately, that's his point, is that Jesus isn't here to placate people. He's not here to impress people. He's not here to just do signs for the sake of signs. These miracles are all pointing forward towards Jesus' ultimate conclusion, towards that finality of the cross and the empty tomb. And that's why it's so important that the disciples understand what's going on. And this is what we're going to talk about Monday, is Jesus is going to build off of these two occasions, really these three as well as the feeding of the 5,000. He's going to build on this whole section of narrative and try to get the disciples to understand what's going on. And he's going to do that in one of my absolute favorite miracles, that is the healing of the blind man, the only miracle in Jesus that seems like it doesn't work at first. And we're going to talk about why that is. That's going to be what we're going to talk about on Monday, that healing of the blind man. It's only recorded in Mark. It's one of the most impressive and most beautiful narratives in all of the Gospels. Thank you so much for watching this. Thank you so much for taking the time to study these things. It's been so appreciated by me to have these opportunities, to have the incredible blessing of being able to spend my days studying these things and talking with you about them. It's just that there's no greater blessing in the world than being able to do this. And so I'm so thankful for y'all's support, for your continued enjoyment of these things, your continued zeal for the Word of God. Can't wait to continue, and hopefully, all things willing, all things ready, Lord willing, we're going to get to have the chance to spend tomorrow together, to enjoy one another's company, and most importantly, to worship the Lord together. We're so looking forward to that. We can't wait to see that. We love you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next time.